Okay, let's unpack this. You probably picture China as this unstoppable force of urban growth, right?
Hmm.
Endless skylines popping up, cities just getting bigger and bigger. Well, get this. By 2020, roughly one-third of all the cities they looked at in China had actually shrunk.
A third.
A third. So
Yeah.
today, you and I are taking a deep dive into this surprising world of shrinking cities in China, going way beyond the usual headlines to understand what's really going on.
What's fascinating here, and maybe a bit counterintuitive, is that this really challenges that dominant image, doesn't it? That image of relentless urban expansion in China.
Totally.
The fact that such a significant number of cities are losing population suggests there are some really interesting dynamics at play beneath the surface.
Exactly. And we've got some compelling research to guide us. This deep dive is based on a study called Shrinking Cities in China, a long-term metropolitan perspective, which appeared in the journal Cities.
Right.
And what makes this study particularly insightful is its approach to defining what we even mean by a city. They're using international standards, looking at the bigger picture beyond just, administrative borders.
That's a really key methodological point. The study uses the OECD definition of functional urban areas, or FUAs.
FUAs, okay.
Think of these as metropolitan areas, the dense central part of a city, sure, but also those surrounding areas that are linked through daily commutes and the local economy. It gives us a much more realistic view of how a city functions as a whole.
Right, the functional part.
Exactly.
So our goal today, for you, the learner, is to really get our heads around this research. We want to see just how widespread this shrinkage is, what kind of patterns emerge across China, and maybe even touch on some of the driving forces behind this unexpected trend.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at the long arc, right, from 1980 right up to 2020.
Across different regions, without drowning you in a sea of numbers, hopefully.
So this immediately brings up a fundamental question. When we talk about a shrinking city, what exactly does that mean according to this study? And how are they defining the city itself?
Good question.
Their definitions are precise, which is what makes their findings so robust.
Right. Let's nail down these definitions then. For a city to be considered shrinking in this study, it had to experience a population loss of at least 5% over a 10-year period.
Okay, 5% over 10 years.
Yeah, so that's not just a blip. That's a noticeable and sustained decline.
Precisely. That 5% threshold over a decade helps to weed out short-term ups and downs and really identifies those urban areas facing a more serious and persistent trend of depopulation.
Okay, got it. And then about the city part, we mentioned these functional urban areas, the FUAs. Can you paint a clearer picture of what one of those looks like?
Certainly. The FUA definition has two main parts. First, you have the urban core.
Right.
This is the really densely packed central part of a city. Think of areas with lots of high-rise buildings and busy streets, with at least 50,000 people living at a density of at least 1,500 people per square kilometer in connected grid cells.
Okay, so that's the traditional downtown and those surrounding high-density zones.
Exactly. Then you have the commuting hinterland.
The hinterland.
These are the areas around that central core where people live but often commute into the core for work and other economic activities.
Right.
These areas have a lower population density, at least 300 people per square kilometer, and a significant portion of their residents commute into the urban core.
So looking at the whole economic engine, isn't it? The central hub and the connected surrounding areas, rather than just where the official city limits happen to fall on a map.
That's the crucial distinction. And this is where it gets really interesting when we talk about shrinkage.
How so?
Well, if we only look at administrative boundaries, we might miss some important shifts. For instance, the population in the official city center could be going down,
Okay.
while the suburbs within that functional urban area are still growing.
The classic donut effect,
Exactly.
where the hole in the middle gets bigger, but the dough around it stays the same or even expands. So by using FUAs, this study can tell if the entire connected economic region is losing people or just that central core.
Precisely. It allows for a much more nuanced understanding of where and how population change is happening within what is, economically speaking, a single integrated area.
Okay, so with these definitions in our toolkit, at least a 5% population drop over 10 years within a functional urban area, what does the big picture of shrinking cities in China look like from 1980 to 2020, according to this research?
What the study reveals is a really fascinating story that unfolds over those 4 decades. In the early years, from 1980 to 1990, shrinking cities were quite uncommon.
Right, you'd expect that.
Yeah, the researchers only identified 9 cities that met their criteria, which was less than 1% of all the cities they examined.
Tiny percentage.
Very small. And these were mostly smaller and medium-sized cities. This fits with the overall boom in urban growth that China was experiencing during the initial phase of its economic reforms.
That makes perfect sense. It was a time of massive migration to the cities, so widespread shrinkage would have been, well, unexpected. So when did the tide start to turn towards this phenomenon of shrinking cities?
The significant shift really occurred after 1990. In each of the 3 decades that followed the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, the study found that between 20% and 30% of Chinese cities experienced enough population decline to be classified as shrinking.
Wow, that's a dramatic leap from less than 1% to potentially almost a third in just a decade or so.
It is indeed, and the patterns within those decades are also quite telling.
Oh,
In the 1990s, they observed high rates of shrinkage in those smaller and medium-sized cities. Then, in the 2000s, which was a period of incredibly rapid urbanization across China,
yeah, the big boom years.
the rate of shrinkage actually decreased somewhat. But then, in the most recent decade they analyzed, 2010 to 2020, there was a resurgence of shrinking cities, and perhaps most surprisingly, larger cities started to be affected more significantly.
Huh. So it wasn't a straightforward, constant decline for these shrinking cities. It had its own ups and downs, almost mirroring the broader economic shifts happening across China.
Exactly.
That's one of those aha moments, isn't it? Shrinkage isn't necessarily a one-way street. It can ebb and flow.
Precisely. It really underscores the dynamic nature of urban change and suggests that, a variety of different factors have been at play during these different periods.
Okay, so we know it's a significant phenomenon affecting maybe a fifth to a third of cities post-1990.
Yeah.
And we have a timeline of when it became more prevalent. Now, let's talk geography. Where in China are these shrinking cities located? Did the study reveal any particular regional patterns?
Absolutely. The study provides a really insightful look at the geographical distribution of shrinking cities over time.
Mm-hmm.
In that initial period, 1980 to 1990, remember those only 9 cities?
Yeah, the handful.
They were primarily concentrated in the Sichuan and Chongqing areas, as well as in eastern Hubei province, so quite localized at that point.
Okay, so fairly localized back then.
Yes. But as we move into the 1990s and 2000s, the picture becomes much more widespread. Between 1990 and 2000, shrinking cities appeared in almost every region of China.
Wow.
With the notable exceptions of Hainan, Qinghai, and Xinjiang, the inland agricultural provinces such as Sichuan, Hubei, Anhui, and Henan experienced significant population losses.
Okay.
And so did the northeastern industrial Rust Belt, Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning.
The Rust Belt, right. That makes sense.
Interestingly, the more economically developed coastal regions tended to have lower rates of population loss during this period.
Which likely reflects the ongoing migration from the interior towards the booming coastal economies. Yeah.
Exactly. That aligns with what we'd expect, people moving towards areas with more job opportunities. Then, in the 2000 to 2010 period, a clearer regional concentration emerged, which the study aptly describes as a shrinking city belt.
A shrinking city belt, where was that?
This belt was mainly situated along the Yangtze River, encompassing Chongqing, Sichuan, Guizhou, Hunan, Hubei, Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu provinces.
A shrinking city belt in a nation renowned for its rapid urbanization. That's a striking and somewhat paradoxical image.
It is, and this belt actually intensified in the most recent decade, 2010 to 2020.
It got worse.
It seems so, yeah. Furthermore, shrinkage spread again to almost all regions, echoing the pattern of the 1990s, but with a significant difference. The rates of population loss were noticeably higher, and they even started to observe cities experiencing population losses exceeding 25%.
25%. That's a really significant level of decline. That's not just slow shrinkage.
No, it's really stark. So it's not just a slow trickle of people leaving these areas. Some are facing quite rapid depopulation.
So the regional patterns really highlight that urban shrinkage in China isn't like a uniform thing. It's happening in different places at different times and with varying degrees of intensity.
Suggesting a complex interplay of regional economic and social factors.
Okay, so we've looked at the broad trends and the geographical spread. Now let's drill down a bit. What did the study discover when they examined the population changes within these shrinking functional urban areas themselves? We touched on that donut effect earlier.
Yes, the study specifically investigated the population changes in the urban core versus the surrounding commuting hinterlands. And what they found was that the most common pattern of shrinkage in Chinese cities is indeed this donut effect.
So just to be clear, the population in the central, most densely populated part of the city is declining, while the surrounding areas, the commuting zones, are either growing or at least not declining as much.
That's the predominant trend they observed. Population loss was most frequently concentrated in the central urban core of these metropolitan areas.
Okay.
Conversely, the scenario where only the hinterlands were shrinking while the core remained stable or even grew was quite unusual. Rare, actually.
That's interesting. It's almost the opposite of what we often think about in terms of urban sprawl in, say, growing cities, where everyone's moving out to the suburbs. Here, it seems like people might be moving away from the core altogether.
Or perhaps relocating from the core to the hinterlands within the same FUA.
Right. So it's not just the familiar story of people moving to the suburbs. In many Chinese cities, it seems the core itself is becoming less attractive population-wise, which is a fundamental shift in urban development patterns we often associate with growth.
That's a really insightful way to put it. However, while the donut pattern was the most common, the study also found that many cities experienced population decline across the entire metropolitan area, both the core and the hinterland.
Okay. Not just the donut hole.
Not always.
Hmm.
This overall metropolitan shrinkage was more prevalent back in the 1990s, but it actually reemerged as a significant trend in the 2010 to 2020 period.
So it's not always just about the central area hollowing out. Sometimes the entire interconnected economic region is shrinking. That certainly complicates that initial picture you might have of people simply moving outwards from the city center in China.
Exactly. It really underscores the importance of looking at the functional urban area as a whole to truly grasp the scale and nature of urban shrinkage.
This is all incredibly interesting, but it naturally leads to the question of why. I mean, what are some of the underlying factors that might be contributing to this widespread phenomenon of shrinking cities in China? Even if the study didn't focus solely on the causes, did it offer any potential explanations?
Well, yes. While the study's primary goal was to map and quantify urban shrinkage, it does suggest several potential driving forces behind these trends. One key factor they point to is the increasing competition among cities for resources and talent.
Right.
As some cities grow and prosper, they may attract population and investment away from other areas. Think of it as a national-level version of the local competition you might see between a downtown area and its suburbs.
So like a talent drain towards the more successful urban centers. And investment drain, too.
Precisely. They also highlight regional economic disparities, with the developed coastal cities continuing to be a major draw for people from the less developed inland and northeastern regions.
That makes sense.
And the decline of traditional industries in areas like the Rust Belt is another significant factor that likely contributes to population loss in those areas. As those older industries decline, people may move away in search of new job prospects.
That's a pretty clear link. As traditional jobs disappear, people will naturally look elsewhere. Makes sense.
Additionally, the study touches on the concept of economic and demographic polarization.
Polarization, how so?
Well, where very large and successful cities like Beijing and Tianjin might be attracting resources, both human and financial, from their surrounding areas, potentially creating what they term poverty belts around them.
Wow, that's a fascinating and slightly unsettling idea. The success of some megacities potentially contributing to decline in their neighboring regions, like a shadow effect.
It is, and the study also briefly mentions other potential contributing factors, such as the depletion of natural resources in some areas, the ongoing transformation of industrial sectors across the country,
Right, restructuring.
and the increasing trend of population aging, which could contribute to overall population decline in certain cities, regardless of migration.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a really complex web of interconnected factors at play, not just one single cause.
Definitely not. And this study really provides a valuable foundation for further research into the specific causes in different regions and individual cities. It's important to remember, as you said, that this particular study was primarily focused on documenting the extent and patterns of shrinkage using their standardized definition.
Got it, laying the groundwork.
That's exactly right. Their main objective was to provide a clear and consistent picture of where and how urban shrinkage is happening in China, using a methodology that allows for comparisons both within China and internationally.
Okay, so let's synthesize all of this for you, our listener. What are the main things we should take away from this deep dive into shrinking cities in China?
Well, I think the first key takeaway is simply that the phenomenon of shrinking cities in China is much more prevalent than we might have initially assumed.
Yeah, that headline number.
By 2020, roughly one-third of all the cities examined in China had become shrinking cities when viewed through the lens of these functional urban areas.
That's a really significant portion of the urban landscape. It challenges the narrative.
Indeed. The second crucial point is that this isn't a uniform or static trend. It has evolved considerably over time,
Right, the ebb and flow.
with a notable increase in recent years and a spread to a wider range of regions. The emergence of that shrinking city belt in central China is a particularly striking aspect of this evolving pattern.
And finally, when we look within these shrinking metropolitan areas, what's the most common pattern of population change again?
The study highlights that a donut-like shrinkage is frequently observed, with population loss concentrated in the central urban cores, while the surrounding commuting zones may be more resilient.
But not always.
And not always correct. It's also important to remember that many cities are experiencing shrinkage across their entire metropolitan area. So for someone trying to understand the future of cities, where to invest or even where they might want to live, these trends paint a really different picture than the one we usually see of just endless growth.
Definitely. So we've covered a lot of ground, but the core message for you, the learner, is that China's urbanization story has this fascinating, less publicized side about urban decline happening right alongside the more commonly known growth. It really forces you to reconsider the narrative of just constant upward growth everywhere,
And considering China's massive ongoing urbanization and the recent policy emphasis on metropolitan area development, the findings of this study raise a critical question, I think.
which is
How might this understanding of shrinking cities influence future urban planning and regional development strategies? What are the implications for how resources are allocated and for the well-being of residents in these areas? This research provides a crucial baseline for understanding some of the emerging challenges that China faces as its urbanization process continues to unfold.
that's a really important point to ponder. It's not just an academic finding, it has real-world implications. This research really gives us a new lens through which to view urban development in China. We hope this deep dive has broadened your perspective.
And if you're keen to explore this topic in even greater detail, the original research paper in Cities offers a wealth of additional information on their methodology and findings.
Absolutely. And as always, we're eager to hear what other surprising trends or studies you'd like us to unpack in future deep dives.